prefers in order to hear us. Yeah, that we know. But then in terms of language, so if we'll just wait a few minutes, one more minute perhaps, to let people in. So let's get started. So welcome everyone to our session on using climate lens as a multiplier effect for positive philanthropic impact. Earlier today, we held two sessions, one in French, one in English, on impact and responsible investing with our partners at Foundation Investing 2.0. In collaboration with the Clean Economy Fund, we held the first panel this morning where we heard about sustainable finance and ways of accelerating the transition to a sustainable post-COVID-19 economic recovery and the role that Canadian foundations can play to support it. And in the second panel, also organized in partnership with the Clean Economy Fund, we will hear diverse perspectives on how young people aren't approaching climate change action in a silo and how their approach could not only challenge the funding community, but also bring multiplier impacts across sectors. So let's get started. It is my pleasure to introduce to you our moderator for this session, Joanna Leffler, who is the Executive Director of the Clean Economy Fund, a Canadian charitable funders collaborative focused on helping Canada make a successful, resilient, and prosperous transition to a low-carbon economy. After a career in politics and the not-for-profit healthcare sector, she spent the last 15 years working on climate change in Canada and internationally. From 2004 to 2006, she served as an advisor to Prime Minister Paul Martin, including for COP11, the last UNFCCC negotiations hosted in Canada. She co-founded the Business of Climate Change series of conferences in Canada, served as a strategic advisor to the Global Campaign for Climate Action, Canada's Eco-Fiscal Commission, Clean Energy Canada, and Smart Prosperity. So welcome, Joanna, and thank you for being here. I will hand it over to you to introduce yourself a bit further and our great lineup of speakers. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Thank you again for inviting us to the Clean Economy Fund to collaborate with you on your conference this year. One of the things that we talked about when we first spoke was how climate change, I think people generally know it's an intersectional issue, but how groups are really approaching this and they're not able to silo this as an issue because their audiences don't want to silo it either. And there's a real pressure, I think, coming from the grassroots that we can't just deal with these issues in a silo. So I thought this would be a really interesting opportunity to bring 4 organizations to the PFC, so you can see how different organizations are innovating on the ground. And I have to say that when I was looking at how to introduce everyone, it all of a sudden occurred to me as I was writing out their titles, they're all founders. They're all founders of their organization, which speaks to the innovation going on with these specific personalities in how to approach social issues. So what I'm going to do is actually something a little bit different. Rather than me read out their biographies, I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves, but really their story. I always find people's origin story, how they came to this issue, how they ended up here today, incredibly interesting. And I'm going to start with Marika. I met Marika last year. She'll tell you more about plusone.org and her background, but I met Marika last year at the kitchen table of the Eric and Sylvie Trottier's home. Sylvia invited me to meet Marika because she wanted to know more about climate and climate solutions. Plus One was interested in moving in that direction. And of course, I jumped at the chance. And Marika won't tell you, so I will. Marika, she used to play in a little band called Arcade Fire. And so that's really how, it's just interesting. I always find the evolution to how people arrived at this issue and at this time, because I also think it speaks to the intersectionality of the issue. So Marika, why don't we start with you, and then we'll move along the panel.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone on this panel. Thank you so much for having me and us here. It's really, I think, an important time to be speaking about this, and really critical that we're all here. So thank you so much. So as you mentioned, I'm a musician, an artist, and a lot of my work through culture really ended up, driving towards this necessary relationship between culture and social change, culture and mobilizing people, and how, in order to mobilize for positive social change, culture really plays a critically important role in that. So as artists, I was, in a band that did very well, and we ended up having a lot of access to understanding, of meeting folks, of learning, of, being able to play a role, and an increasingly larger role in holding a microphone and being on stages and in front of thousands of people. And with that was a really important responsibility of, what do we do as cultural leaders, and what are the framings that we're helping put out into our societies and into our communities, and realize the tremendous impact that when culture, like, you can say something, you can have the head of the WHO out there telling us all to do things, but when it gets into through a culture and through an artistic lens, and when we have art at the forefront of some of these messagings and some of these framings, it actually gets in so much more easily. So, Arcade Fire was working in Haiti. We were working on primarily global health equity issues and health access. And we founded Plus One of just this mobilizing of people. We now are the trusted partner of kind of 250 artists across the world. We've been able to unlock, $12 million in novel financing for really important social justice and environmental justice causes. And as you mentioned, we've recently, over the last 2 years, put climate really as one of the forefront priority issue areas, because it intersects with all of the other social justice issues that we've been working on for the whole history of our organization over 6 years. So, for me, it was really important as an artist and as being in that scope. I looked around and I said, with this access and this responsibility, how can we connect more and more people to this movement? Cultural leaders were looking at us saying, how can we be useful with these holding a microphone, and how can we be useful being on stage and with folks looking at us? And so Plus One's really built to bridge subject matter experts, lived experience, community leaders, and issue area experts, linked in with the biggest cultural leaders of our communities, all the various communities, and really making sure that is linked and close, so we can push massive mobilization towards equity, towards justice and access.
Thanks, Marika. The thing that I've always grabbed onto that you said, and I quote you all the time, is that you can't get social change without culture change. And you just understand that fundamentally, and your artists understand that fundamentally. And we'll look forward to exploring that a little more as we move forward. I'm going to ask Larissa Crawford to step forward and introduce herself. I'll tell you a little bit about, Larissa's the one person on this panel that I didn't know before we started, although I've had the privilege of listening to at least one of her talks. Larissa spoke on climate equity and narratives to a group of NGOs probably a few months ago, and that was my first exposure to her. Larissa founded Future Ancestor Services, which is an Indigenous and Black-owned, youth-led professional services social enterprise that advances climate justice and equity with a lens of ancestral accountability. I don't know a lot about Larissa, but I'm hoping she'll tell us a little bit more about herself, but how she ended up in this space.
Great, thank you, merci. Hello, danse Larissa Crawford Dishnik, Goshen, Calgary, New Weekend, puis mi famille, Jamaica, puis Penetangwesh, New Weekend. Bonjour, bon midi. Je m'appelle Larissa Crawford, je suis à Calgary et j'ai une ascendance métisse de Penetangweshin et une ascendance afro-caribéenne de Jamaïque. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Larissa Crawford. I introduced myself first in Michif Cree and then in French. And I am working through the process of reclaiming my French and of reclaiming that Michif Cree. I also introduced myself in acknowledging my ancestry. So I carry Métis ancestry that we can trace to Penetangweshin, Ontario, and then Afro-Caribbean ancestry from Jamaica. And I passed this ancestry on to my 4-year-old daughter, Zaira Nova Hunchak. Now, if I'm to think of my origin story, I think the first milestone, and I'm going to try to make this as tangible as possible for someone who doesn't care too much about me. But I'd say that I really started on a journey of understanding what kind of impact I wanted to make by first understanding myself. So really allowing my understanding of ancestry, my understanding of my personal ancestry, but then also of my group ancestry, and allowed that to really inform my understanding of strength, my understanding of my capacity to overcome adversity, and then my responsibility, and acknowledging some of the crappy things that my ancestors did. Some of my Métis ancestors owned Mohawk slaves. The men on my father's side have not been role model fathers. So in understanding not only the resilience that comes from my bloodlines, but also the responsibility I have to correct intergenerational trauma, that I have to correct some of the ways that my family members have contributed to colonial oppressive systems, has really informed my commitment to this work in a very personal way, and has brought me from a place of not knowing what to do to having a better understanding of what I can do, having a better understanding of what I should be doing and what's appropriate to me and my identities. And so I really, in my late 20s, had more exposure to mentors, Black and Indigenous mentors, who really supported me in these journeys. And I wouldn't have been able to get to a place where I so clearly understand the impact I wanted to make until I understood myself, the communities that I have, and then also the relationships I have to the original caregivers in both ancestry and today. How am I honoring those relationships? Now, if I think of environmental spaces, especially in my work with climate change, it happened almost as a fluke. It happened when I applied teachings that I received from these Black and Indigenous mentors. So right out of graduation, I got a position with the Ontario Ministry of Energy, and I had no energy experience. I had no formal education in the environmental sector. But I recognized that my background in anti-racism and Indigenous research is so important in climate change, especially in energy work. And although the application didn't create space for me to say something like that, I went into those interviews and I told them, you know what? I carry lived experience of belonging to these communities. I carry lived experience of navigating society in this way. I've studied these aspects of how policies impact people differently. And this is a qualification that will allow me to do this job differently. And I went and I told them that. I helped them along in understanding diverse ways of acknowledging and valuing experience and knowledge and wisdom. And because I did that, I got a position. And then that's really what sparked my interest in doing environmental work, but then also realizing the necessary work that needs to be done, especially with regards to recognizing the intersections with equity. And I'll just take about 30 more seconds to say, after a long journey in government and nonprofit, I ended up starting Future Ancestor Services. I can speak a bit more to it. I'll share some more links in the chat. But we started that in response to the fact that we need to see this intersection being highlighted and being named and worked through, these intersections of climate justice and racial justice. And we need to be able to do so in a workspace that honors ourselves. The group of people I work with, we have never experienced a workplace that truly honored our disabilities, our identities, in ways that we felt really satisfied. And so that's another big reason why we started Future Ancestor Services. So I'll stop there. I'll share some more info and follow-up information in the chat. But from there, I'm excited to join in on this panel.
Thank you for sharing that, Larissa. Thank you for sharing that background with us so beautifully. We are going to get into everyone's respective theory of change, so we'll have an opportunity to dig a little bit deeper there. Myron, wow, I'm going to let Aaron start an organization called Future Majority, which is really about giving young people the political strength that they have in this country. 40% of voters are millennials and Gen Z, but they don't often, they don't necessarily know how to use their power, and they have a lot of power. And Aaron, I'm just going to allow, I love everybody's story. Everyone's got their own story. And I wonder if you could start with sharing yours and how you ended up back here in Canada.
Sure. Thanks for having me. I grew up in Toronto, and growing up, like, the only job that was like possible for my my parents, who had, like, you know, their grandparents had left Europe in the 1930s, early 1940s to come to Canada and the United States, was like, you got to be a doctor or you've got to be a scientist. And going into university, I studied, I'd had a few family members who'd had cancer, and I was really feeling like I should really make a difference. There should, you know, my dad was a psychiatrist, my mom's a psychologist. I've got lots of problems from that, which I don't want to talk about. I'm nervous because I'm speaking to all these screens, but I really felt like I should make a difference, and I'll be a biologist, and I'll study, like, how do you do algorithms to find mutations in genes? And that's how I'm going to make a big difference. And I was sitting and part of taking biology, you take environmental classes and you take environmental health. And I was sitting in these classes, and they're going over, here's a chemical that lots of people have in your food, you have it in your water, it's a runoff from mining, and it's still in play. And then here's another bad chemical that you should know about. And I was just sitting there boiling, going, how is this possible that we know about all of these problems, we're not doing anything about it? And it became really clear to me, two things became really clear to me. One is that I'm way too extroverted to be, like, doing coding to find computational biology is what I was studying. It's like, how do you find, like, mutations in genes using algorithms? And then two, for whether it's climate change, it's inequality, it's mental health, it's public health, we have so many technical solutions out there. Like, there's really clear policy solutions, there's really clear scientific, there's really clear tech, like physical engineering solutions. And what's lacking is political will. And so I, like, massively pissed off my parents when I graduated university. They're like, there'd been this 3-week period over the summer where they'd forced me to, like, write the graduate record exam when I had wanted to go camping with some friends. But so they're like, when are you going to go to grad school? And I totally blew that off and went to be a community organizer, working in the United States. The Congress had just passed a climate bill, and it was going through the Senate, and I was going, how can I go to the belly of the beast and make the biggest difference? So I didn't even know where Albuquerque, New Mexico was, but I sort of packed my bags. I found myself a job in New Mexico to try and get a senator to pass a climate bill. And what ended up being like, here's this 1 year, I'll do this crazy thing as a community organizer, turned into just under 10 years of working on environmental issues and then progressive issues generally, and candidates and campaigns in the US. So in 2010, I was in Georgia for the midterm elections. In 2012, I was in Nevada and Colorado on the presidential campaign, running a campus Get Out the Vote. And then I started doing some coding stuff. I ran the technology for a large political action organization to build some Get Out the Vote tools. And then after the 2016 election in the United States, and just seeing what was taking place in Canada, I was really feeling like, one, it was time to move back to Toronto, which is where I grew up. And that two, the scary, hateful populism, the flaws in the American democracy and what was happening when you don't have an engaged and informed public, I started to get really worried that Canada, which I think of as home, that something like that could start to happen here. And so I moved back to Toronto. I put everything in my Honda Civic and drove back to Toronto. And that was the process to start Future Majority.
Great. And we're going to come back and talk about what Future Majority did in its first year, and then and go from there. So, okay, Dominique, the other, both Dominique and I are here in Ottawa. So certainly last but not least, now the interesting thing about Dominique is, again, as I was preparing to introduce all of you, Dominique's organization is the only one that actually has climate or environment in the name. So again, speaking to the intersectionality of issues. So Dominique with the Youth Climate Lab, again, another innovator, and I'll just turn it over to you, Dominique.
Merci, bonjour tout le monde. Je vous rejoins aujourd'hui du territoire non cédé du peuple algonquin. Thank you, Joanna, for that intro, and super excited to join this amazing panel. So I'm called to this work because fundamentally I care about people. When I was younger, I wanted to be a doctor, and turns out I hate blood. And so when I was trying to figure out how can I still help people and not be a doctor, I decided to study environmental studies. So I like this question because it makes you think of the big moments or the big shifts in your life. And I think a big one for me was actually attending University of Waterloo, environmental studies, and then going to the UN climate negotiations. Waterloo generally was a great experience because of its emphasis on co-op and entrepreneurship. And in short, learn by doing, and if it doesn't exist, create it. And so I think, though I didn't, take any specific entrepreneurship classes or whatever, those are still kind of big messages that we heard even in our environmental classes. And it's also at Waterloo that I had the opportunity to go with a student group, the UW climate students, to the UN climate negotiations. And a big moment was, the Paris Agreement in 2015. I was there as a student, as an undergrad. I was doing research. And it was just an amazing and such a privilege to be there for so many reasons. One, we actually had a Paris Agreement, first time in that comprehensive agreement in over 20 years. But also because it was this big moment for me where on one hand, and I was actually doing research and I was in a number of the negotiations supporting a delegation. And so on one hand, I was there covering very technical negotiations. And on the other hand, I was hanging out with friends that I was meeting from all around the world who were so passionate, who were leading incredible efforts in their own communities, who had funded their own way to go to COP to basically be shunned out of the negotiations and be told, okay, you stay at the door while, the adults are negotiating. And so it was that sort of contrast of this technical, very hard to understand, very hard to access space that were ultimately making decisions that are going to impact our futures and our future generations. And the contrast of the energy, the innovation, the collaboration that I was seeing from my friends that were working on the sidelines. And so when I came back from Paris, I had a lot of great conversations, and one of those great conversations was with my co-founder Ana Gonzalez, and her background is in working at the local municipal level. Her experience was, working with nonprofits, working on municipal action. And so we got together, and ultimately, coming back from this sort of international level, we just got together and we started talking about, of course, how different the global, like what was happening at the international level and how different that was taking place at the local level, but also that there's a lot of similarities. One, we were both frustrated at the lack of support and the lack of recognition of young people. We started Youth Climate Lab in 2017, pre-Greta. So when we first started, there was a lot of actually conversations to even just convince people that we needed to listen to young people. And so, yeah, I think it was just kind of coming together with Ana and recognizing the shared similarities, the shared challenges, shared frustrations, that no matter what level, young people were under-resourced or often tokenized, that no matter in different countries, young people, especially those on the front lines, especially from Indigenous communities, were not being listened to and being not considered. And of course, the silos that exist between, what's happening at the local or what's happening at the international or what's happening in one sector over another. And so that really what brought us to create Youth Climate Lab as a lab, so we can really experiment with different models of engagement and different ways of making those connections.
And we're going to come back to you and just talk about different multiplier effects and that kind of thing of the work that you're doing. But it's interesting that all of you talk about, again, not so much by design, but the way it really worked out, and certainly a passion that I have, is that we do spend a lot of time as philanthropists focusing on essential technical and policy solutions. But at the end of the day, if we don't have the culture and the social mandates, then those solutions tend to be temporary. They're easily removed by political cycles, and so really that's what we're talking about here. I'm going to just mix it up a little in terms of the order, but so I'll go back to Erin for a sec. Erin, so we first met not that long ago, really, about maybe a year and a half ago, and you had a plan you were really worried, and we all were, frankly, about the carbon tax discussion at that time in the country. That was, I felt it was almost a surrogate for climate action. Like if the country votes down a carbon tax, that could be a license to really just not do anything on climate. And so you started to organize and I'm going to ask you to talk about that in terms of where you organized. And I think Future Majority is largely not a digital organization. We often think youth organizations are on social media, and that's what they do. Erin's got a very different model, and I think it's from all your organizing experience coming out of the United States. But if you could tell us a little bit about that. And I also would like you to just lean into how you had to pivot, come when we had COVID. So. Sure.
So let me take a step back and just talk about like big picture, like why get people involved in the democratic process for a whole, for one, there's like the inherent value of having a robust democracy. And I think with that, forget talking about climate change for a second. Can you imagine if on October 22nd, 2019, which is when the last election ended, and there'd been a change in government, and we were worried about imagine what's happening in the United States was happening here in Canada. And there's obviously major differences, but it's the sign of a really ill democracy. And there's inherent value in having an engaged and educated public who believes in their democratic institutions. And that in of itself has value. And young Canadians vote at lower rates than any other age group. So that's one reason that we do this. And then if you think about the issues that we care about, 90% of young Canadians care about, it's climate action, it's access to mental health services, it's racial equity, and it's affordability, whether it's post-secondary education or housing or rent. And so for future majority, we're going like, we're thinking like, as the last election was coming up, for the first time in generations, there's more young Canadians eligible to vote than any other age group. But the reasons why young Canadians aren't voting, which gets into why we go face to face, is not because like they don't understand how to vote. It's compared to most countries, it's really accessible and easy to understand. It's that most young Canadians go, when I think about voting, they're hearing about pensions, RRSPs, balancing the budget. They're not hearing about climate change. They're going, climate change, oh, that's like more of a recycling issue. Or I don't have a great job, that's because I'm not working hard enough, or I didn't study hard enough. And our job as organizers is to have conversations with people face to face, ideally, because they go, oh, this is another young person, this is a trusted messenger. And to say, hey, these issues that you're facing, they're not your problems, they're all young Canadians feel these problems. And so future majority, our strategy to do that, like if we had billions of dollars, or maybe not billions, but way more money, we talk to every single young person. But if we want to get, one, more young Canadians voting, and then two, we want to get politicians talking about these issues and creating this positive feedback loop where politicians talk about climate change and all of these things, we have to get politicians' attention. So what we did in the last federal election is we raised some money to hire 31 organizers, which are folks mainly right out of university or college. We trained them. We did a 10-day organizing boot camp where we trained them on how to canvass, how to make phone calls, how to train volunteers, how to do those sorts of things. And then we sent them to campuses throughout Canada. So in Moncton, in New Brunswick, in the 905, post-secondary campuses where they're likely to be decided by a really small vote margin, and where tens of thousands of young Canadians go to school. And every day, these organizers would go person to person, one conversation at a time, having 5 to 7 minute conversations about the issues that young people care about. It's called deep canvassing is what we were doing, collecting people's contact information, and then calling them every single night saying, it was great chatting with you. Can you volunteer with me tomorrow? And over the course of 6 weeks, we built a team of 700 volunteers, because you can imagine each of these organizers is speaking to 95 people a day. And then you're recruiting, there's like a funnel, which I'm not going to get through the math. And then when the on-campus voting approach, there's 5 consecutive days of on-campus voting on each of these campuses. We got all of these volunteers. On some campuses, we had 40 volunteers to literally go, hey, have you voted yet? No, sorry if I'm shaking the screen as I gesticulate. Great, let me walk you the polls and let me give you information about which parties are likely to be competitive in this riding and what their positions are on the issues you care about. And in that process, we turned out 26,000 young people to vote in these ridings. In a handful of them, that was more votes than the riding was decided by. And the MPs started calling us like within a couple of weeks, asking to say, hey, would love to talk to these students, these young people, hear what they care about. So that's what we did during the federal election. And we had all these volunteer teams in communities going door to door, hanging out at strip malls. A lot of these places are in the suburbs. And when the pandemic hit, one, we shifted away from talking as much about climate change because it's not really on folks' radar. We shifted to talking about mental health. All of us here, even if it's stigmatized, we're all like, you tell me if you're not having a tough time and I want to know your secrets. But we started doing virtual town halls with MPs. So we just are wrapping up this week our second round of virtual town halls, where we can typically get between 100 and 150 young Canadians physically sitting in a Zoom room, having a conversation with their MP. So that includes like Patty Hayju, who's the Minister of Health. We just had a meeting last week where we had 120 people in a Zoom room, but close to 1,000 people watching on Facebook and Instagram Live and YouTube, where we can say, hey, we're voting in record numbers. These are the issues we care about. We'd love to see them prioritized by you in the future. So that's a little bit of our approach and what we've been up to.
Well, I think, Aaron and I were both, there was a lot of excitement, I think, about what Aaron was doing. And Aaron had lots of plans to go up to Quebec music festivals this fall. And he and Marika had actually connected on a whole bunch of stuff. And the Decemberists, I think, were going to, at their concert at Roy Thompson Hall that was supposed to happen in August, they were going to be a dollar from every ticket was going to go to Future Majority, but even more importantly, they were going to use their platform to talk about Future Majority. So there's so many cool collaborations that, you know, bringing these groups together and working together and building off each other. So there's so much potential. But then, you know, like everyone else, pandemic hit, and you know, for an organization that works face to face, it was a real challenge. But I thought the town halls were, I thought, a brilliant idea, and most importantly at that time, an opportunity for community to come together. So youth, you know, most youth were like, pack up, you're out of here in 24 hours coming out of their universities, right? Still working from home, but very isolated from their peers, from their professors, whatever. And of course, you had to do it by Zoom, but still, you created a community for people, for the youth to come together and tell you really what they cared about at that moment in time. It gave them agency at a time when they probably didn't feel like they had very much. And it gave them a community and a tribe. And if they chose at that time to not talk about climate change, but to talk about mental health, that's all good, right? I mean, you're creating, they're all, it seems like youth, at least the youth that I know, are concerned about climate change. In fact, you know, polls show across the partisan spectrum, youth are concerned about climate change, whether they're conservatives, independents, liberals, whatever, NDP. So they'll come back to that issue when the time is right, but you're showing them, you're giving them, you're empowering them and showing them how to use their power, and you're giving them agency. And I just think that's so amazing. And you've managed to pivot during this pandemic, so that's great. Marika, just because I've just leaned into your model, we didn't really get into so much the +1 model. We talked about the dollar a ticket, but and obviously you had an evolution of work too. You have so many artists that you work with, and I should say across North America, right? That also tour globally. So you have a huge platform and a lot of interest from all kinds of artists who have very different audiences. And that was part of our discussion. Marika and I had probably a day-long session in Montreal about a week before we went into lockdown to figure out, you know, how to give artists the tools to take climate to their audiences. But and you've had to pivot, of course, because of COVID as well. So maybe you could talk a little bit about your model. You worked, as you said, very much on health, international health. Partners in Health were a very important partner for you, and climate is starting to come into that conversation. But maybe you could just take us through some of you've got some great anecdotes and success stories and things that really have propelled you forward.
So, you know, and I think it's kind of echoing Aaron and Future Majority, and I think a lot of us actually together on this panel, where I think we're really in alignment, is in this idea of mobilization and mass mobilization around creating that public pressure, knowing that a lot of that public pressure then directly affects public and private sector, directly affects policy. So, you know, where +1's approach has really been is aligning cultural leaders, and it has been with artists, it's been with comedians, you know, everybody from like Arcade Fire and the National, and you mentioned the Decemberists, to Selena Gomez this summer, aligning with, you know, Sam Smith, with a tremendous number of 250 artists, but each, like you said, with their own individual fan base, with their own tone, with their communities that they're building. And it's really aligning those cultural leaders with subject matter experts, with grassroots leadership, with organizations, with the framings, and able to kind of help bridge, ensuring that with that microphone and with that platform and with that audience, that we are shining a light, not as experts ourselves, but being able to really, you know, leverage the platform and the help. You know, most of the calls we got this summer were like, I know what not to do right now, but I'm really struggling with what to do. And so leading into this moment, as you mentioned, Plus One really worked in the live space. It was a really important thing for us. I think, my personal background was really like fed off this live interaction. Our band was a really live band. And one of our major practices at Plus One is, of course, meaningful wealth transfer and meaningful wealth distribution, and feeding back into these communities, these organizations, and these leaders who are at the front. So it becomes this kind of ecosystem of culture change, unlocking funding, and feeding it back into the system. So we did work primarily in the live space. And as you mentioned, one of the things we did for that meaningful wealth transfer is anybody that's involved with Plus One has kind of taken on this commitment, the long-term commitment to actions that drive social and environmental justice. And so one of them is a minimum commitment of $1 per ticket that will be aggregated and fed into additional grant making. And so with that, in 5 years, we've been able to unlock $12 million across North America, work with extraordinary people and organizations, create those framings. And then when COVID hit, we had a big year ahead of us this year. And a lot of that really shifted. But what didn't shift was the drive towards art and culture as being what was gathering folks online in a different way, in a virtual way, and a reliance on that culture for beauty, for togetherness, for understanding, but also then an artist's need. And those are the phone calls that, that were coming into us, which was, I need help right now. And I need that education. I need that ladder of engagement. And artists want to do right by the issues, knowing that they are not experts. And I think having that vehicle to connect with subject matter experts, to connect with grassroots leadership, and be able to say, how can I shine a light on you, on your voice, on the platform? How can I frame these issues to have as much positive outcome and impact as possible? And of course, then for us, that means keeping climate, mental health, affordability, just as Erin said, these are important, health access, racial justice and racial equity, keeping those in conversation on a daily basis, keeping it in the media, keeping it important, and building that public pressure that then is needed to move both, the public sector, but also the private sector, in how we are all organizing together for those outcomes, those policy outcomes and business decision-making outcomes that we see as being really positive.
I think that's so, having those cultural leaders, but having Plus One as the connective tissue there is just so fundamental, right? How many times have people said, I wonder if we can get so-and-so to help, well, here you are, and you're that connective tissue, and you're the trusted person that they're coming to. And I also, some of the things that stood out from our conversation, a few months ago, which now feels like a decade ago, was, just the different audiences like that you have. I think you work with, I think you mentioned Andrea Bocelli, who's got an older woman kind of audience, and you've got, country or regional acts, and it's really exciting, the opportunity for these different cultural leaders who have different audiences to all take that climate concern message forward. I think that's just amazing.
I think it's when you have like you said, Andrea Bocelli and Billie Eilish and right. Broken Social Scene in the same world, we're able to kind of, I love, Erin often talks about the kind of messy middle folks, of the folks that are not yet fully don't have either the awareness or aren't fully yet engaged with an issue. And it's a really helpful lens to meet as a lot more people with really accurate and effective and helpful messaging.
Well, it creates a community, and this is something I'm going to go to. Larissa has, if you're following along the chat, has unfortunately been reconcussed, so she's got her screen off. So Larissa, heads up, I'm going to come to you after Dominique if you're feeling up to it. But Dominique, COVID has just, if you can talk a little bit about, you already leaned into quite a bit about your theory of change and who you're working with, but maybe you could lean into a little bit of the multiplier effect, the gap that you're filling, the gap that you are filling now. I mean, you're incredibly busy, and you work globally. But also maybe if you could lean into, if you've got any thoughts about this moment of pandemic, because I think at first I was sort of feeling, well, isn't it great that people are knocking on doors for their seniors and neighbors? Can we get groceries for you? Blah, blah, blah. People keep telling us we're in for a dark winter. And, you know, I worry a little bit that, you know, in order to work on climate change, frankly, you need to be physically and mentally well, right? You need to feel like you're part of something, like you're not alone, and worry a little bit about where but it could also work the other way. Maybe we're going to be creating a better community coming out of this. So I'm going to ask you if you could address through a few things out there for you.
Sure. Yeah, that's a lot. I'm excited.
It's a lot, I know.
Well, first, our mission at Youth Climate Lab is to enable youth to build the just climate resilient futures that they deserve. And so we've been talking about this moment of 2020, of the pandemic, of like Black Lives Matter, of like this roller coaster, the burnout that we're feeling, like all of this, 2020. We've been talking about it as a moment to create new, not normal. So this is a moment for us to create the just climate resilient futures we need. And so a lot of the work that we do involves designing projects, co-design projects. And we're really inspired by the work of Creative Reaction Lab. They're based in the US. And the way that they view design is, you know, if systems of oppression, inequality, inequity are by design, then they can be redesigned. So to that, we add, you know, if the systems that are holding climate inaction in place are by design, then we can redesign them. And we can design projects that can support young people to reimagine and to rebuild those systems. And so that is really what informs the work that we do and why we focus our theory change on co-designing. And we do that with focusing on 3 different shifts. So shifts that need to happen to get us to that resilient future. One of them is on skills shift. So we really needs to be, we're working to equip young people to take transformative action in their communities. Working on a policy shift, really to challenge how young people are involved or how they understand climate policy and how they can influence it. And a finance shift to disrupt capital flows, to be more equitable and to support young people so that they can start and scale their solutions. And so with all of that, and this year, it's been a challenge for sure. I mean, we're a team of young people working to design for other young people with other young people. And so there's been a lot of course, immediate needs. And of course, the connections between, you know, COVID now and climate action. We're seeing, you know, the federal government saying, oh, you know, COVID has derailed our climate plans. We're going to push that a little bit further. And understanding that there are immediate needs that need to be prioritized, but for us to really try to leverage this moment to make those connections. One of the areas of work that we've been and particularly exploring is youth unemployment, which has been a big issue, a big implication due to COVID. And so there's a lot of young people who are unemployed right now or who are underemployed. And in parallel, those young people want to be employed in sectors that, you know, matter, that have purpose, that are in line with their values and in line with the action that they want to take, like climate change. And so we're trying to kind of connect the dots between how do we invest in young people in youth employment now, but how can that be, you know, directed in a way that is in line with the low carbon transition? How can we talk about climate jobs, climate careers at this moment as a way for the government to invest to support young people today and then put us on a path so that we actually meet our climate targets? So I think I would maybe start with that. Other thoughts that come to mind are more around how we've worked. We had a few in-person events planned as everyone else. And we were able, thanks to our funders, to reallocate some of the travel money that we had planned for those events and actually host and employ 5 young artists to actually contribute to our project. And so through that, we were able to support 5 young artists over 6 weeks. It was kind of like a mini residency. And it was a really cool learning for us because that was the first like official formal time that we were working with artists and arts-based methodologies. And it was an interesting process for us because we were still kind of, getting to the goals of working with youth. This project, it was focused on hearing their thoughts on the low carbon transition. And we ended up producing a virtual gallery and giving them funding. And it was really cool. There was so many different mediums. One artist, their medium was jean jackets. Other artists, it was unreal. It was amazing. So I think we've taken this time to very much like experiment how we can make connections between COVID and climate, how we can employ arts-based methodologies and really seek to, widen the tent on who's talking about climate. And I think maybe just a last thing I'll say is, it's been challenging. It's been difficult. We kind of joke, it's like burnout season. And so it's joke and not joke. It's really important to also consider that like when we talk particularly about climate change, something we often hear is, oh, youth will like save us. Thank God the youth are striking. Thank God the youth are there. So we're told this, and at the same time, we're kind of shunned and not listened to in terms of decision making. And so that on top of eco-anxiety, climate grief, the pandemic is just a lot. And so maybe I'll end it like that. Yeah.
No, it is a lot. It's important to acknowledge, I don't know about you guys, but I often start my calls nowadays with how are you? No, but really, like, how are you doing? Right? I mean, just a little check-in, in a way that maybe we didn't before. It's we need this, right? We need each other for sure. Dominique, you and I can maybe have an outdoor skate or something, right? Same city, so there's that. We'll get to have some 3-dimensional time. Larissa, the pandemic. Well, first of all, your theory of change. If you leaned into that a little bit during your introduction. But also the pandemic. In very stark terms, are you optimistic or not optimistic about how we're going to come out of this as a society? So I'll turn it over to you on that note.
Yeah, sure. So I'll share in the link in the chat, a link to the document that I'm talking to, or the theory of change. I'm someone who needs to read in order to retain information. And we have a theory of change at Future Ancestors Services. So I'll just share this. Let me make sure. Can y'all see my presentation slides?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I have 3 monitors, so I don't know which one y'all are seeing. But Future Ancestor Services, so our theory of change is this: by prioritizing equity and climate justice in our work and lives, we are striving for the just futures we and our communities have defined and continue to defend. We leverage Indigenous teachings of future ancestry to frame our ways of being, because it provides a narrative by which we can all understand ourselves as being accountable to the actions, inactions, faults, and resiliency of our ancestors, while also finding collective power in our agency to act with impact as future ancestors. So I can stop screen sharing, but that's really our theory of change and how we operate and why we operate the way we do. And if I'm to think, like, I'll say this: Future Ancestor Services, we were launched in April. So we were launched in like the very beginning of this pandemic. But we had planned to be a remote service firm initially. And the way we were set up, and the way we set up in the months before COVID really took a toll on our society, we were already kind of thinking like that. And so it's been very interesting to see how our work has changed now that everyone is starting to restructure in a similar way to how we imagined being structured. If we're to talk about coming out of COVID, like, I think it's really important to acknowledge the time we're in now, and to futures thinking, yes, and we talk about futures thinking quite a bit at Future Ancestors Services, but to really acknowledge what we need to do now. I did an interview with one of our with a person in our network, and her name is Jessica Katwaro Green, and she had said, and this was in April, she had said, I'm seeing a jump in my services. She does anti-racist services as well. And she's like, I see a jump in our services. And I asked, well, why? Why do you think that? And she had said, well, companies are slowing down. A lot of organizations have to slow down now. They have to not only think about how they're structured, but about their work. And the coinciding movements of social justice, racial justice, is causing us to further reflect on what we're doing as organizations, how we're doing it, how sustainable are we? A lot of organizations are realizing, wow, we actually didn't need to travel as much as we thought we did. Wow, we didn't actually need to force everyone to come into this office the way we thought we did. And so I think it's really important to name that thinking and to spend time really reflecting on that, because what COVID is really doing for us right now is highlighting the inequities that have always existed. But it has also given power to social movements that are telling us in what directions we need to go in order to not only address climate change, but to address the systems of oppression that we experience now. And I know this isn't exactly in response to the direct question, but I think it's important to acknowledge with regards to the work that I do and the work that our team does with really focusing on that intersection of racial justice and climate justice. And working in a minute, and I'm saying this because we're doing this work amid COVID-19 time when people are slowing down and taking more time to think about this. But if we're to think of the root causes of why we need to do climate change work, why we need to do racial justice work, if we look into the history behind that, and Dawn's shaking her head because we did an engagement where we really looked into the history of this. If we look at even our understanding of race and the process of organizing socially and dividing ourselves into equal or separate and unequal races, that phenomena is actually really new in human history. You don't see that come out in English language until you see the transatlantic slave trade gaining force, until you see the birth of settler colonialism. And so if you dive deeper into this history, and I'll give like a 10-second summary where this was also happening during the late Age of Enlightenment. And so there was this livening of the ideals of human freedom, human equality. But there was this contradiction between humans are free and equal, but we're killing and enslaving and stealing indigenous bodies from Africa and indigenous peoples who are taking the space or who occupy the space that we want to colonize, set up our colonies. And so there was this contradiction between all humans are free and equal, but we're going to treat some humans not like this. And so in order to resolve that contradiction, you saw at this time the emergence of race science in order to rationalize that some people are actually closer to being animals, and therefore it's okay to treat them like this. Whereas some people, white people, are fully developed humans, and therefore we deserve freedom and equality, but not these people who are closer to animals and who are actually just whole different races. And if we look into the reason why this happened, this is really where we see the birth of our modern racial structures and systems of oppression. But if we look into the intention behind that, the intention behind that was to set up these colonies and extract resources with cheap and enslaved labor. And that to me truly highlights that our fights with climate change or for climate justice are the same fights we need to be making for racial justice and vice versa. We need to be addressing those root causes. And I know this isn't in direct response to the idea of COVID work, but this is especially important to understand why this is our theory of change and why we believe so strongly that we cannot pursue climate change work without acknowledging the social systems we're operating within. Because if we don't name that, we can't name the barriers that we're putting in place for diverse people, diverse teachings, diverse knowledge to inform how we address climate change. And it's only when we embrace that leadership and that knowledge that we can pursue the addressing of climate change in a way that is more effective and more relevant than keeping those people out. And I think amid COVID and COVID-19, this has provided us a space to slow down and really think about that. And the movements, the racial justice, social justice movements we're seeing is requiring us to think about how we're not only meeting sustainability needs, but how we're meeting the needs and addressing the systems of oppression we're maintaining and creating. And for me, as we come out of COVID eventually, I have hope that because we have not always organized like this, there's another future that we can imagine. There's another future that we can work towards, if not within our lifetime, then in the next for future generations. So I'll stop there. But that's
wow. Hard to follow that. That was amazing, Larissa. Thank you so much for articulating that. 2020 has been quite a year on many levels. It's been a really hard year for me personally. It's also been a real education on COVID. Immediately showed all the fractures, the inequality in our society, what we value as society. We need so many people to make our society run, and some of those are the most poorly paid people. And then we had the Black Lives Matter movement really take hold and really educate people on things like white privilege. And it's been 2020 has been a year. It's been a hard year, but in many ways, I think a learning year and maybe a hopeful year in terms of what we can do going forward. But I don't think anyone could have talked about the intersectionality better than you just did. We can't change one system and not change the other system. It doesn't work that way. If we want systemic change, we have to get systemic change. So working together is essential. Actually, so I think we've got another 15 minutes. I'm going to remind everyone to please either post your questions to everyone or send a note to me or Jahan. But I'm going to ask you guys this and put you on the spot a little bit. What, from your perspective, what is the role of philanthropy, Canadian philanthropists, in this space? I'm going to pick Dominique first, I guess.
Sure. Okay, great question. There's a lot. There's so much potential. There's so much potential. I think when we think of climate policy, and I think I came from an earlier talk today at the Canadian Science and Policy Conference, so my brain right now is on policy. But when we think of policy and we think of what governments are doing, yes, governments set the course for climate mitigation, how we need to reduce emissions and enhance resilience in communities. Policy plays an important role. Of course, governments play an important role, but that's not enough. We need to not only push and then hold accountable governments, but really work to fill the space between the political commitments that are being said and what's happening and what they're actually doing. And that's a big space, and I think philanthropy has a role to play to fill that space. I think there's a few different kind of avenues. One, I would say very much the youth climate movement, the organizations like Future Ancestors, they just started this year. A lot of philanthropy funding is inaccessible to a lot of nonprofits. And so I think thinking about what is youth responsive, youth accessible funding is a really critical role that is just not being filled by even governments. I would also add, I think in terms of other gaps that are needed when we think of climate change, is really around collaboration across sectors, across generations. I think even this pandemic, there's a few sort of generational, older folks are saying, oh, young people are partying and they're contributing to the spread, and the young people who are unemployed are frustrated that they have it harder than their parents. And I'm seeing, on social media, different things sort of against generations, and really what we need to do is work together. And the types of initiatives that can bring us together, the types of work that can really foster and facilitate creative, disruptive spaces for us to work together. I think philanthropy has a role to play in making those happen. So maybe I'll come back after that, but that's kind of what comes to mind right now.
That's great. Thanks very much, Tom. Marika, role of philanthropy.
So I agree with Dom. Absolutely. I think that, I think philanthropy has a really important role in funding initiatives that create the public pressure, that are needed to move both the public and the private sector. And I know that's kind of my thesis generally, but I think that, philanthropy can play a huge role in leading the charge, and where government will look to seeing what's effective and how can we take some risks in funding, or how can we believe in some of these novel and important solutions that are there and that exist, and we can give voice to and time to and resources to. And so I believe that philanthropy plays an incredibly and hugely important role in leadership in this moment, quite frankly, right now. Mm-hmm. And it's really about those initiatives and funding these initiatives that create the public pressure. We need to move the public and the private sector in climate, in equity, in justice, in, and fund some of these new models that have been previously kind of considered immovable. So.
Okay, I don't want to, it's a bit awkward, but I'm going to ask you, Marika, anyway, if you can answer it. If you have a is there any, and I don't know if this is the case or not, because we didn't talk about this in advance, but do you have any kind of frustration with like the philanthropic community? I don't mean just generally in applying for grants or explaining your theory of change, or are things just kind of rigid in terms of, or you don't really fit into a cultural stream, so you can't apply with this funder, but are you finding people are generally kind of open to your theory of change?
I think that thoughtful funders, I don't know, it's hard, right? It's hard to see the audience here. Can't read the room.
I know, right? It's so difficult with all those black
tough crowd. No, I'm kidding. So I think that there's there are yes and no. I think yes and no. I think increasingly we are seeing thoughtful funders move into systems change and move into systems thinking, and really looking at intersectionality. And I'm so grateful, Larissa, for the wisdom and diving straight into what you shared. It is so hugely important to hear that, and those are necessary lessons that have to be embedded into the work that we're all doing and that we all participate in. And so I think that there are funders that are ready for that are taking that responsibility of kind of moving into systems change work and thinking about, these new models. Things have been considered immovable, and they're willing to kind of step into it as leaders and do that. And then I think that there's some funders that, have some work to do there.
Right.
You know, I think that, you know, there's a history of siloing things and having portfolios, and this portfolio being separate from this one and this portfolio being separate from the others. And I don't see it working that way going into the future as much. I don't see these separate, really siloed portfolios working separately from one another, particularly when we're talking about these big systems issues, including, you know, like health access, climate that affects all of us. There's public and there's private sector that everybody needs to be involved. Racial justice and reconciliation.
Right.
You know, these things are not siloed as separate. You know, to kind of do that, I think does a disservice to what is possible in radical partnership and really working together across.
I love that terminology, radical partnership. I love that. I'm going to use that one too now. Thank you for that. Aaron, role of philanthropy.
I sort of think of it in, to not repeat like lots of ditto for what Dominique and Marika were saying. Two things come up to me that I can think of. And like, I often think of this as like, let's say there's an issue that you care about, or a broad, like an outcome, like a more, I think probably everyone here is like more just world, clean and just and fair world. I sort of think like there's the element of risk. For, you could say, okay, I'm like, soup kitchens are pretty, like an easy example. Like, I'm going to give money for a soup kitchen, and my inputs for like every $1, I get this number of widgets of folks getting soup. And I think that's really important. I've volunteered. I was living in Boston. There was like a really meaningful, like halfway house that I would volunteer at. But there's an element where if you're thinking about systemic change, you can say, hey, I'm going to add some risk to my portfolio where I'm going to invest in changing a policy or addressing some of the systemic factors that address these problems. And it's high risk, high reward. So there's a chance that if you want to have an impact on a policy that's going to dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that you can lose, right? Like, you could put some money into movement building or into whatever it might be, and you lose on that policy. But if you win, you're unleashing potential regulation, incentives, changing laws. You can have a way bigger impact than you could ever have with your, individual widgets of subsidize, buying solar panels for folks, eating my example. So that's the first, is I think that if you're thinking about systemic change on these problems, you're like, you want a diverse portfolio. It's like, this is a high risk, high reward opportunity to be thinking about what are some of the systemic problems and what are the policies and changes that you can do to do that. The second is you can invest in something that's a long time horizon. Like, if you think about training youth organizers to mobilize their communities to have higher civic engagement in voting, like, that is not a 3-month grant deliverable problem or a single, that's like that can be your life's work to address these problems. We're doing culture change where you're saying, how do we empower artists to use their audiences to talk about and educate and engage all those folks? Like, that's not going to be like Marika running a one rad concert. That's like a 5, 10, 20-year problem longer that you're fixing. And I think you can, for me, when I think about philanthropy, I'm going, how do we, like, you don't get return on investment in 1 year. How do you think about a long-term return on investment on some of these big systemic problems?
Yeah, I'm just going to thank you so much, Aaron. I am just going to post my email here to everyone in case if anyone wants to fund any of these groups, please contact me or PFC. There's my advertorial. And systemic change, one of the things when the Clean Economy Fund was formed 4 years ago, we kind of did this Venn diagram. As I've heard from some funders, if you've met one funder, you've met one funder. Everybody has their own personalities and their own interests and their own boards, of course, et cetera, et cetera. But you find that Venn diagram of where do you want to work together? Like, what are the characteristics of the Clean Economy Fund? And one of them was patient funding. We need to have long-term patient funding. But saying that and doing that is a really hard thing. Like, people understand it, but at the same time, I think people are also sort of like, well, we did that last year. Let's do something different. And it's really important. We also learned, just, working with, we had a study from the Climate Works Foundation, which is the world's largest funders collaborative based in the US, but does global work. And their first iteration of their collaborative, one of the lessons out of that was be prepared to pivot and recalibrate all the time. And so I think you can do patient funding as long as you're always testing, is this working? Okay, it's not working, let's recalibrate, that kind of thing. But certainly, you guys are all founders of various organizations that are all pretty recent and have some phenomenal deliverables outcomes that you've already delivered. And now is the time, I think, we need to attract funders, though, to give you that sustained funding and core operating funding, right? Which is critical. So Larissa, I'm going to turn it over to you. And then I haven't seen, okay, you sent that to everyone. Someone in the chat messaged me privately, can you address why climate engagement has been a white person thing? And in response, I'll share this article, which is really great for the context of Canada. Why is the environmental movement so white? Yes, I think a lot of people ask that question, and thank you for sharing that, Larissa. Actually, you're up, Larissa. I haven't seen, unless anyone else has questions or comments, we've had some really lovely comments as you all were speaking in the chat, so thank you for those. You actually did get into a little bit about the role for philanthropy in your last intervention, without adding that specifically, but I'll just turn it over to you, as everyone else has had a shot at that, if you have any other perspectives on that.
Yeah, no, I've definitely learned a lot from the other responses. I'm really appreciating the dialogue that we're having. If I'm to think, and I'll share with regards to what I found my biggest barriers have been to accessing funding. My biggest barriers, and the barriers that I find people in my network who are Black, Indigenous, or racialized, and who have organizations where we're doing climate change work, but it may not be traditionally understood as climate change work, what our barriers have been. And one is, we are a for-profit. So Future Ancestor Services is a for-profit business because we can't incorporate as a social enterprise. So we have to incorporate as a for-profit and then structure ourselves as a social enterprise. And so that automatically takes us out of the running for so much funding. And I don't know if there's what's going on, and if it's just because that's how it's always been. But putting the requirement that an organization has to rely on grants to operate is difficult, because we chose a model where we can generate sustainable income, where we are going to look for grants and funding, especially as a startup. But we recognize we want a sustainable income model, a revenue model. And so that's been a big barrier, that requirement of being a nonprofit. And I'd say there's more and more organizations that are facing this barrier, who are recognizing that they want to provide services that generate income, but we're structured in a way where we operate very similarly to a nonprofit with regards to how we're using those profits and the kind of services we provide to the public. So that's been one really big concrete barrier. Another has been requirements with regards to having operated for 5 years or more, having operated for 3 years or more, even having operated for a year or more. And I understand that it has to do with risk, but immediately disqualifying organizations because they haven't been up and running for 3 years is a significant barrier, especially for people now who are only now being able to access a lot of the resources that we need to incorporate, or that we need to make work that we've been doing for a long time formalized. And so years of existence, it also creates a barrier with regards to age in some cases. where it's more difficult for younger organizations to access that funding. And I understand, again, rationale with regards to risk, with regards to all of these different things. But I would argue that that piece of qualification and immediately disqualifying certain people because of the years they've been operating is a significant barrier that I'm seeing a lot of. And then finally, a lot of these organizations and organizations that don't use an equity lens, that don't use an anti-racist lens, are often creating barriers for us. If they don't understand why it's important that we serve specifically certain populations, if they don't understand why we need to bring in elders and why so much of our budget may be allocated to engaging elders, or so much time is invested in our events because relationship building is important to us, then it's harder to get that funding. We work with a lot of clients. We work with a lot of clients in philanthropy, in nonprofit, in granting. And it becomes a significant barrier when the entire board is white, when the entire board carries the same cultural worldview. It becomes very difficult for us to advocate and create a rationale that is truly understood by decisions being made with regards to funding. And I worked at a granting agency. I worked as a granting coordinator for some time. And it became very evident to me how people's, especially unconscious bias, they have the best intentions, but have racist impacts. And we can acknowledge that someone can have a good intention, but have a racist impact as well. I saw that play out day in and day out at the granting agency, where people were making decisions on gut feelings or making decisions on organizations and work that they felt more comfortable with, not realizing that the ones that they always feel more comfortable with are similar in age, race, ability, disability. And so that lack of infrastructure, that lack of consideration, I've seen really good organizations who have all white boards, but who really employ very strongly an equity and anti-racist lens as they try to build their capacity and diversity. They're doing really great work. But this is creating significant barriers to accessing funding beyond the traditional scope of what is worthy, what should be funded, what is climate change work. So I'll leave it at that, but those are the three biggest barriers that I'm seeing and that my peers are seeing and experiencing.
Thank you so much, Larissa, for putting that on the table. I think, you know, I think funders are waking up to that, so those sorts of barriers, and people like you and Dominique who've been able to voice that, those barriers I think have been really important. It's hard to, I think, you know, I find Canadians just generally are a fairly small C conservative bunch, and it's important if you want to have innovation, you have to take risk. You have to take risk, and so not everything we do as philanthropists is going to turn out great, but you know what? We always will learn from it, and maybe it'll point us in the right direction, which I think is something we have to keep in mind. So we are a few minutes over, and I want to thank the panel for coming and joining me here today. I always learn a lot when I talk to you, and I did today as well. And I'm going to turn it over to Inez just to say goodbye. And yeah, that was terrific. And we held almost all the participants until the end, even though we went over and it's almost 5 o'clock. But thank you again. So over to you, Inez.
Thank you, Joanna, and really thank you for your leadership and helping us put this panel together, and for inviting these inspiring people. Really, I was scotché, as we say in French, on my chair the whole session. So thank you so much, Marika, Larissa, Dominique, and Aaron. I invite everyone to join us tomorrow. Our first session is at 10. And we'll talk about the SDGs and Agenda 2030. And before that, we will unveil a mystery video that we want to share with you. So we invite you to log in at around 9 for that unveiling. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Merci, merci.